So I've got 12:05, which I think means we might want to go ahead and get started as people keep logging on, just to be respectful of everyone's time. I expect we're probably catching many of you on your lunch break. So thank you so much for spending your lunch break with us. Please feel free to, eat your sandwich, whatever you need to do in this time together. We're grateful you are all here. So yeah, on behalf of CBI, we want to welcome you to this event this afternoon. And we're really excited because this is the most people we've ever had registered for one of our monthly virtual Fault Lines conversations. We've been doing some sort of virtual event pretty much on a monthly basis now, giving folks the opportunity to really engage with that Fault Lines theme that we introduced at the 20 stakeholder breakfast, just in a different way, sometimes deeper, sometimes top. And yeah, today was by far the biggest we've had. We've had about 120 folks sign up to participate today. I expect some folks will join us live. A couple folks might catch the recording, but we are really excited to have you all. And to me, that response really speaks to the value of the LGBTQ plus bus tour we did in person back in 2019. And then also just the amount of interest there is in our community as far as this part of our history in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. We chose for this conversation this month in honor of Pride Month. And sometimes nowadays, Pride can feel a little bit like a party, and it certainly is, but at its heart, it's really a way of remembering our LGBTQ plus history and honoring those who have paved the way for all of us, both those who took part in the original Stonewall Uprising and those from other places and times. And so I'm really excited just personally, and I know CBI is more broadly, to be able to offer this and to be able to learn this piece of our local history. So with that, I will pass the virtual microphone to my colleague, Christy, who will give us a little bit of context about this Fault Lines theme and how we've interpreted it over the past several months now that we've been using it. Christy?
Great. Welcome, everybody. It is so fabulous to see so many wonderful faces that I haven't seen in a while, and new names. So we know at the end, we're all going to be great friends. But I just wanted to give a little bit of context about what we mean when we use the phrase fault lines. Of course, folks generally are familiar with the geological fault lines that exist deep in the earth. And we are probably walking around on them and don't even realize they're there until enough friction builds up that it requires a response. So friction builds, those plates slide, and suddenly we experience a tremor or an earthquake. And we would posit at CBI that while yes, there are geological fault lines, there are also social fault lines. And we've been practicing over about the last year, not quite a year, but for a good bit, in thinking of how to use the analogy of social fault lines to help folks access vocabulary and a language for talking about equity and the inequities that exist in our community. And I would just invite you today. This is a little different from other fault lines conversations that we've offered. Most of those have had a built-in conversation time, but today we're really going to be taking in information, but we do invite you to use the chat. If a thought or a question comes up, please use it, and really be thinking about the fault lines that you see and experience. There can be fault lines in each of us, personal differences in perspective that perhaps create a divide between us and other people. And in the same way, fault lines can exist within communities. So we just invite you to use that frame as we hear from Josh about some history that not a lot of folks probably know. And then we'll reconnect back at the end. But I am going to turn over the mic to Annetta, who's going to give us a little context as we get going. Thanks so much. Annetta.
Thanks, Christy. Good afternoon. I was morning. Good afternoon, everybody. It is so great to see all of you. Thank you for thinking enough of us to spend time with us today. So one of the signature programs at CBI that I have the privilege to lead is our historical bus tours. Dr. Tom Hanchin and I have been doing those tours for the last 12 years. We're in our 12th year. And of course, when the pandemic happened, we had to figure out a way to pivot like most organizations. And we decided to do a virtual bus tour. So we've been doing virtual bus tours for the last 15 months or so. And the request for them has not stopped. And they are just as engaging and people love them. Because of the information about Charlotte and telling that fuller history of how Charlotte came to be. In 2019, we decided, again, in honor of Pride Month, to continue that on that road of telling a fuller story. And we did a series of LGBTQ bus tours. And that is when we had the great fortune of stumbling into the life of Josh Buford, who is our guest today. Josh has become a great friend to CBI, and we are very thankful for him. If you don't know Josh, what I will tell you a little bit about him is Mr. Buford is an award-winning historian, archivist, and educator with over 20 years of experience building stronger LGBTQ communities across the United States. Josh is a native of Alabama. He grew up in Anniston. Josh is the founder and director currently of community outreach at the Invisible Histories Project, which you will hear a little bit more about that as well. Josh was also chosen as one of NBC's 50 contemporary change makers, innovators, rising stars, and veterans of the LGBTQ movement. We are very fortunate to have Josh and the knowledge that he brings to help us convey to you a fuller story of the LGBTQ history. It is not absolutely everything, but Josh knows, he knows such a wealth of information that I will turn it over to Josh at this moment, and he will take us into our bus tour.
Hi, everybody. Happy Pride from Alabama. It's like one thing to be in front of a bus and like talking to people. It's another thing for you to be seeing into my like home office, which I'm glad I thought to clean up before we decided to do this. Yeah, so I'm going to turn my timer on because if I don't, I will talk for 2 hours and that's not going to be great for everybody. So Pride Month is really important. It's especially important right now. I think that, you know, the community has made a lot of strides in the last decade or so. A lot of legal battles have been fought and won. And thinking about the way we are doing the work for Invisible Histories Project, what we are trying to do is we are trying to simultaneously make it easier for people to access LGBTQ history in every state in the South that we can get our hands on, but simultaneously complicate our understanding about history. Because right now, the history that you could get, and it's not as much as you would think. You know, the field of queer history is very young in comparison to a lot of other fields. I mean, the first LGBT history textbook didn't come out until the late 1980s. It was 1985. Written, by the way, by a faculty member from the University of North Carolina in Greensboro, who has the distinction of writing the first textbook. But with this much history to unpack, with as much to recover that we have to do, it is difficult to get a fuller sense of the picture, especially when the queer South is left out of almost every single conversation about what it means to be LGBTQ in the United States, because people don't think of us as urban. They don't think of us as, you know, large enough to have these histories. And with all this mythology around the queer South, it's hard to really understand what we look like. And the other thing is, for whatever reason, and this is great when you're running a small nonprofit, like I'm currently doing, but the queer South is really hot right now. We're like super interesting to people. And I'm not certain that that's like a great thing for us, but for the moment, we at least have people looking to us to help complicate the larger picture of what it means to be LGBTQ in the United States. And Pride Month is the best time to do it, because Stonewall was a riot. And we forget when we go back to try to whitewash our history that we didn't start in 1969. The first LGBT organization in this country was in the 1920s in Chicago. And so we've been at this for a long time. It's just that people don't really understand what it's like. So what I'm going to do today, if I can make all the technology work, fingers crossed, because I'm a Luddite, I'm going to walk you through a history of the American South and a history of Charlotte, not the history, because we are still missing huge chunks of material related to local history. You know, a lot of collections are, again, they're very cis, very white, and it is very difficult to get trans histories. It's very difficult to get bisexual histories. And without dedicated work in communities of color who are LGBTQ are often, almost always left out of these conversations too. So what I'm gonna do today is try to show you a little bit about what you could be seeing every single day in Charlotte, you know, if you knew where to look. So I'm gonna share my screen with you. Oh, by the way, the chat feature is there, so drop a chat in if you have questions. Someone from CBI will be moderating that, since I always never look at the chat. So I'm trying to be better about that. So here's my screen share. All right, and we're gonna start from the beginning. There we go. So I almost always start these conversations out with this quote about history as a weapon. This was the motto of the Queer Nation, which was a radical activist group in the 1990s that came out of the push for HIV support and education in the US. What this means is that once we are fully armed with the knowledge of who we are and where we're from, we can actually imagine a future that we are an active part of, as opposed to a passive group of people who are always trying to play catch up to try to get up to other people. One thing that really stresses me out when I think about what young people have access to in regards to their history is that I want them to understand that so much happened before they showed up so they could be inspired by it, not as a criticism of what they don't know, but the possibility of a world that existed before the internet, before cell phones, before we had anything but mimeograph machines and like our tiny little, although I was just about to make a joke about having a telephone directory, but I actually do have a little tiny red one right here. So that's my life. But we have a dilemma in the South. The biggest dilemma is this question of whether or not there is actually a queer and trans history of the American South. And I think we mostly believe that there is. The question is, how do we go about locating that history? You know, we are in a lot of ways starting from scratch. I say as often as I can talking to people about the AIDS epidemic is that we didn't just lose people, we lost memory. And so much of the standard practice that was happening in the 80s when they were, either we were being actively ignored by conservative administrations or people just wrote us off as like not important enough to actually do some work around it. So we had to take care of ourselves. But when people would die from HIV related complications, a lot of times their entire history is just put into a trash can and it is incinerated. You know, they couldn't resell houses of people who had died of HIV in Charlotte, in Birmingham, and Atlanta, unless they literally went in and just rendered it completely neutral. And so we lost an entire generation of knowledge too. So much of what we're trying to recover has this gap in it that we're trying to figure out how to fill it. Now, spoiler alert, there is a queer and trans history of the American South. It is complicated and older than we think and beautiful. It's diverse. And here at Invisible Histories, the more we uncover, the more pride that I feel being a queer Southerner, living in the Deep South, being in Alabama and collecting in Mississippi and Georgia and Florida, and really understanding what it means to give people back that history. And I think these two things, isolation and invisibility, have been defining characteristics of what it meant to be LGBTQ for a very long time. And for some reason, I really think that now that we have cell phones and magic Google boxes in our pocket, that somehow that makes everything better. The problem is when you go online to look for queer history, you're not going to get much of the South because it isn't there, because we're still building the collections. We're still understanding what it means. And so we are still isolated in a lot of ways. You know, the South poses a dilemma because so much of who we are in the South is rural and not urban. And so we have almost no conceptualization of what working class queer people look like, because we think of them living in the village in New York or in Boys Town in Chicago or in the Castro, as opposed to rural Mississippi, which has amazing history in it. And this invisibility isn't just because it doesn't mean you can't see us. It means we don't have the ability to see ourselves. So invisibility in this sense is both cultural invisibility as well as personal invisibility. I mean, here's some facts I'll just drop on you right now. More queer people live in the American South than any other part of the US. 33% of all LGBTQ people live in the American South. There are more same-sex families raising children in Mississippi than any other of all the 50 states. West Virginia has the highest population of trans kids under the age of 20 of any of the 50 states. So we are well represented here. We just don't know how to see ourselves here. And part of what we can do with the history is to fill in these gaps. And I'm sure you are all perfectly aware of how we are viewed, but in North Carolina, if I could give you just a little teeny bit of perspective of what it means to live in a state next to Mississippi where we are 49 and 50 a lot in lists of things, and those lists are not great for us. But living in a 49 state in the Deep South is difficult because there isn't to fear. But that, am I the only one hearing that? Sorry.
I just muted someone.
Thank you. There is a lot to fear, but the thing we don't have to fear is the absence of other LGBT people. It's just that we're living lives very differently here. We have smaller communities, they're closer knit. Our networks are more grassroots. And this escape narrative, while true in a lot of ways, so many people left the American South as soon as they had the economic means to do so. This confuses 2 points. One, that most of those migratory people were not people of color because they didn't have the economic wherewithal to leave places in the Deep South because of economic mobility. So a lot of white queer people certainly left, but a lot of queer people of color stayed. The other thing is, besides this escape narrative, there's a narrative of return, which to me is what defines Charlotte in the 80s and the 90s, is the people who had left, but who learned and came back. And when they came back, they helped to organize a community. And so when it comes to the South in particular, we do have an absence of materials related to scholarly work. People are not really looking at who we are. I mean, there are books about the queer South, but they are very few and far between. And they're certainly getting more frequent. We are right now working with 9 different PhD students around the US who are working on materials related to the queer South. And as my colleague Megan likes to say, we definitely want to complicate people's academic lives by giving them more material to work on. The biggest misconception is this behind narrative. This is the one, if you take nothing else away from what I'm talking about today, let me assure you that the queer South was never behind the national movement. If you look at Stonewall in 1969, in 1970, we have our first Christopher Street Liberation Day, which becomes the Pride Festival. We have our first Prides in the South in 71. Not 15 years after New York, 1 year after New York. In 1970, when the Gay Liberation Front forms as a radical group to push for change at the city, the very first chapter of GLF outside of New York was in Carrollton, Georgia, a population of about 5,000 people. So we were not behind. In fact, in a lot of ways, we were ahead. Mississippi in the 1970s, we have found and located materials related to very radical groups who were organizing to fight their governor for more materials for LGBT people, for more resources, for places to actually have their bars. And so we were never behind. We were just doing it differently in the South. And we definitely have an invisibility of queer historical figures. Before you all hopped on the call, we were just talking about Mandy Carter in Durham, who to me is a wildly overlooked, amazing member of the LGBT community who's been fighting forever to make certain that we have access to LGBT civil rights. And so this return narrative is really important. Between the mid-70s to the mid-1990s, there are a lot of queer Southerners coming home, and we came home for various reasons. We came home because we wanted to be near our families. We came home because we had learned what liberation ideology looked like and wanted to bring it back to the South. We came back South because we fell in love. We came back to the South because we had the desire to return to places more familiar. But when we came back, we brought the things that we had learned in New York, Chicago, LA, and San Francisco with us, and then plugged that in to the things that we would build. I mean, almost without exception, everything that we enjoy about the LGBT community now in Charlotte or in Birmingham is a consequence of these folks returning and then setting up the infrastructure that allowed us to have publications and choral groups and community centers and AIDS outreach groups, because we came back and we formed those groups together. Radical liberationist groups that focus on politics, social life, and religion are also everywhere in the South. My favorite two newsletters, I'll have to pick three. My favorite three newsletters that we've discovered at IHP in the last 3 years are Lesbian Front, which was a radical lesbian newsletter from Water Valley, Mississippi, which has got a population of about 9 people. And it's an amazing one. The header says, Lesbian Front, free for lesbians, everyone else $1. And so it's this like really radical approach to looking at lesbian life in the South. The Front is this amazing, bizarre magazine from 1971 from Pensacola, Florida, which tried to be a magazine for both gay men and lesbians, and it did not work out at all for them. But they just could not appeal to the right groups of people. But that magazine from 71 has all this amazing connectivity in it for people to see. And if I were to, this month in Mississippi is a radical newsletter that came out between 1975 and 1985, which has a ton of stuff in it. You all are very fortunate in Charlotte that Q Notes has been fully digitized, that there is a full run of the front page, which was in the Triangle, available at UNC Charlotte. There's just tons of stuff when it goes to publications that we have access to. And right now, having students go through queer publications is probably my favorite thing that we're doing. So this is a picture of the sign outside of the Lee Museum of the New South. In 2014, we curated an exhibit called LGBTQ Perspectives on Equality, which I hope that many of you got a chance to see. What was the most exciting about this exhibit for me was that we had 4 sections all curated by queer Southerners. And it was so nice to see LGBT Southern people putting their own perspective on national, regional, local, and citywide history. And so many people saw this exhibit, and it traveled for quite a while too. So we took Charlotte's history lots of places. But I think what I want you to understand is the materials that I'm going to show you are available in the King Henry Brockington collection in Charlotte. So you should be thinking about when it's open again, how you could get access to these collections at UNCC so that you could see all these amazing things. But in these newsletters are so many one-of-a-kind pieces of our history. I love this gay 90s one because of this like dot matrix printer situation that was happening with it, which makes me very happy. And of course, there's a bigot in my biscuit, which is, again, one of the most successful protests that was ever put together in the queer community in the American South. We're talking people protesting at Cracker Barrels all the way from Virginia down to Georgia. And so these protests, these ways in which we push back, these ways that we were asking for our own spaces exist in these newsletters so that you can now go back and look and pull them out and say, man, you know, people were doing a lot of really interesting work back then. In the Rising Moon bookstore collection, you know, Sue Henry and her partner, Barbara Park, kept pretty much every single piece of paper that existed in that bookstore on a bulletin board that was in the back. And so within this ephemera, you can find some really amazing things. The support group for women of color that was put together in the 90s. And of course, my favorite, the Third Wheels, which to me is like so jaded, but like also kind of amazing at the same time. It's like people that are tired of their gay friends always being partnered up, so they created a group for themselves. I mean, that's very gay, like super gay. And I love that it existed someplace. You know, when we got this collection a few years ago, I opened up the very first box. The very first folder I took out had a poster that said, are you interested in gay and lesbian history on it? And someone was trying to do a local history project. And I always like to think that we're sort of fulfilling the mission of that flyer from the back of the bookstore for like 1991. You cannot say enough about the hotline that was happening in Charlotte. You know, for one, the local hotline actually lasted longer in Charlotte than almost anywhere in the American South. So we kept this thing open so that people could call in. But in a lot of places now, especially now, my own organization just signed up for a Google telephone number so that we could have a box for people to call and leave us messages for the first time ever, because people really want that moment of saying, I have this piece of material, I'm looking for this, but that connectivity is what's so important. And the amazing amount of lesbian history that exists in Charlotte cannot be overlooked. You know, the WOW newsletter is one of my favorite. There was also a group called Wonderful Women. And so there's so much amazing lesbian history that exists in Charlotte. In fact, my favorite thing that I learned doing this project is that up until there was a national conference on lesbians that happened in Atlanta in 1993. And we got some journals related to some people who attended. And in those journals, it says very clearly, so many women left Charlotte as gay women and returned as lesbians. And I love that idea that they went and they met these other powerful women from the South and found themselves an identity that allowed them to think of their community in a much larger way. I'm only half joking when I say this, but like finding bisexual history is so difficult because we have rendered bi people almost completely invisible in the community. And so if you can find bisexual history, it is like such a win. Like anytime we find a bi collection, I always feel like I should get a day off. So having it there and making it available so that you can see that bi people didn't just appear as if from nowhere. But what's interesting about the history of North Carolina in regards to bisexual people is that, you know, bi people were pushing for the addition of the B in the alphabet soup for a very long time. And they got it at the 93 March on Washington. And so by the time we became the groups of gay, lesbian, and bi people in North Carolina were wildly organized. They had support groups, they had networks, and the Bi Pride Network photograph collection is amazing. So you can actually see these folks feeling proud of their identities and then being, you know, marching in parades and doing all sorts of things. Probably the most fun part of my job, but also the most difficult part of my job is t-shirts and other textiles. Currently in the IHP collections between the 3 states, we have nearly 800 t-shirts, going back as far as the early 1960s, all the way up to one that I just got like 3 days ago. But the thing that I said to the group when we gave this tour the last time, and I'll say to you, is that it is one thing to know who you are on the inside, to know how you self-identify. It is another thing to have that identity enforced and supported by your community. It is something completely different to put an identity on an article of clothing and to wear that into the world with people that you don't know, because you are inviting people to see you in the world. And so t-shirts they're fun, but they're not just for entertainment. They also allow us to put those identities, those affiliations into the world so that people can see them, so they know who we are, so they know what we're about. And I think that t-shirt collections especially make people feel so nostalgic and happy when it comes to, I mean, my very first gay t-shirt, this is not a joke, I got it at Gay Day at Disney in the 90s, and it said, "I can't even think straight" on the front of it. And so I thought that was really funny. That was some 90s humor, pre-Ellen. So I guess we'll see. And then there's almost nothing better than ephemera, I'll be honest with you. Like finding buttons, we have several bracelets from the 87 and the 93 March on Washington. We've got, because we have so much Mardi Gras in Alabama, I'm currently sitting on a collection of a gown that has a 10-foot set of wings attached to the back of it. And so the ephemera just makes people happy because it is so fun to see the things that were made. This Pride in the Park banner, which was handmade, is beautiful and in amazing shape. It looks like it was made 3 days ago. By the way, the pitch that I'm making for people now is don't have vinyl banners printed, because vinyl banners cannot be archived. They are basically slowly degrading plastic garbage. So if you want to march in a parade, make a banner. Run down to the Home Depot, make yourself a banner, because those banners will still be here 50 years from now, as opposed to those smelly banners. And then the small things. I mean, this queer safe sex education booklet, it was printed in Charlotte. You know, it is amazing. I mean, there are several copies in the collection at UNCC, and there's some really fascinating and clear information about safe sex practices for LGBTQ people by LGBTQ people. This little safe sex pamphlet wasn't just informative, it was also in a form of a protest. You know, a lot of activists in Charlotte in the time when it was being printed would leave this places as like a show of solidarity for people who were not out, or as an act of pushing back against places that didn't want to have this information. This also got me in the most trouble I ever got into archiving, because I showed it to a group of students that I thought were high school students, but it turned out to be middle school students, because I don't know what kids look like. And I got in a lot of trouble later about that, but still, I'm glad those middle school kids now have some up-to-date information, because I wish I'd had this when I was their age, to be honest. My straight sex education didn't work really well. And then finally, the physical manifestation of our community. These are surviving murals. I think they're still in the building. We're gonna look at the building in a minute. But Club South was a bathhouse that opened in Charlotte in the mid-1970s. It was open until 1985. All these murals were hand painted. It had an Egyptian theme, but all these murals are hand painted by an artist from Charlotte. And these are the only surviving ones. They're currently in the basement of that building. And because they were in the dark and above the water line, they've actually survived pretty well. But you can see they're not all in great shape. But these little, like, I mean, honestly, like, it's like uncovering a little treasure trove. I mean, when I got to go down into that basement with a group of students and we took pictures for several hours, we found all kinds of amazing ephemeral items that were just sort of sitting there kind of waiting for us to archaeologically dig them out so that people could see them. So I wanted to do that so I can give you a sense of like where my brain is, where we're coming from. For the rest of the time, I'm just going to give you some information, and I have the information printed. So at the end, if anybody wants access to this, I'm happy to pass this along. These are just my notes, so I keep things gay in my head while we're doing this. So let's start with Holy Trinity Lutheran Church. So what's interesting about this space isn't just that it's been the home of multiple organizations that are LGBT. It was at one time the home of Time Out Youth. It was the home of the One Voice Chorus. It is now currently the home of the Pride Festival, Charlotte Pride. Getting this space in the neighborhood is important for lots of reasons. One, because the plaza has a huge queer history related to it. Back before the city really got to be as big as it was, the plaza was one of the places where people were engaged in survival LGBT sex work. And so that part of the plaza had a pull and a draw for a lot of LGBT people, especially as they were leaving work from uptown and coming home into the neighborhoods. And so having a space for our organizations on this is a historical connection, as well as one that shows a solidarity of an organization that is religious. Very many LGBT groups got their start in religious buildings, in synagogues and in churches of all kinds all over the American South, because supportive congregations understood that if religious organizations stepped up and supported them, then they would be able to grow. They would be able to have a safe space, and not just a safe space from violence, but a safe space to actually sit and to grow as an organization. And so I think that we don't give enough credit to places like Trinity Lutheran for doing the work of making places like Toy safe, so now they can have that beautiful facility that they have. Or the fact that, you know, the Pride Festival has grown to such a level to produce one of the largest prides in the American South. Like, that happens because we have the physical location, and that is happening in this building. And you can't always see that from the street as you're driving by, although this time of year you absolutely can, because there's like yard signs everywhere for Pride Month and pre-Pride flags, which I'm seeing everywhere. The thing about the LGBT Community Center of Charlotte, this is its original location, which is now several shops and restaurants on Central Avenue. The thing about the center is, what I want you to know, besides the fact that you're driving past its original location literally every day from the plaza, although I can't imagine that the traffic has gotten any better on Central since the last time I was in Charlotte. But this center didn't just happen. Like, the idea of putting together an LGBT center started almost a decade before it actually opened. The community came together and did community surveys. They asked people what they wanted. They solicited for funds. They hired an executive director, our recently departed friend, Dan Kirsch, who stepped up to lead this space. And the center itself, whether or not it's not currently in operation anymore, but the center existed as a place for people to get resources, which was its primary job. It existed as a place for education, but it also existed as a very big statement of who we were as queer people living in Charlotte. Because it is one thing to have a bar, and there's plenty of bars, and we're going to talk about some of them. Bars are great, but a community center acts differently. It has a different function than a bar. A bar is temporary. Even if it's been open as long as the Scorpio has, it's still a temporary space. A community center says, we live in this neighborhood. We're not just a business in this neighborhood, we live in this neighborhood. And so the LGBT Community Center of Charlotte did so much good work. I mean, when I first moved to Charlotte in 2012, the first thing I did was to go to the community center's location at the Music Factory and volunteer. I volunteered to organize their library because I'm a nerd. But like, having that place to go was one of the most exciting things about moving into a city. what we've discovered is this community center model is still so relevant to what we're doing right now, because even though people are coming out much younger, they're still not coming out into places with tons of resources. And so having a center makes sense to consolidate for all of those people who don't have the economic privilege to be able to access the queer community anytime they want, when they need a place to go. And for a lot of people, this is trans identified people, LGBT youth, and queer people of color. They need that space so they can go and actually get the support that they need in one location so that they can also grow and become leaders in the community, which is how this works. So the White Rabbit has had an interesting history in Charlotte. You know, being an LGBT bookstore in Charlotte is not a new idea. We're going to talk about Friends of Dorothy and about Rising Moon, which I mentioned earlier. But, you know, what I love so much about the White Rabbit's current location is that it literally couldn't be gayer. Like, you're driving down the street and you see it and you're like, oh, yeah. That's okay. I got it. That's a gay store. And so it really does exist as this kind of like point of pride, because for me, we talk so much about what's missing in the community and how many resources we need and the dilemma that young trans kids face. And all that is true, but there is still time and space for community joy. And without joy in the movement, there's no movement. And there's no purpose for the work that we do if we're not celebrating who we are as a community while we're doing it. And so in its original site, which is on the controversially named street, Rensselaer, I've never known how to pronounce this. There's a lot of arm wrestling about it, but its original site across from what is now Bar 316, that whole area there was LGBT-owned businesses. And so it made sense to open up the business, you know, next to the bar. And when they moved the White Rabbit to Central Avenue and also gave a home to Q Notes in the back of the White Rabbit, it became a space that sort of stood on its own. And so I think that's like an important thing to keep in mind about how important these are. And by the way, people want more LGBT bookstores. You know, we just opened 2 LGBT bookstores in Alabama, one in Birmingham and one in Montgomery. And so the bookstore model is coming back because people really want to shop local. So Marshall Park, here's the thing I love so much about Marshall Park. Marshall Park has the distinction of being a space that potentially wasn't necessarily built to become a site for protests and marches, but it certainly did through the course of its life. And so in the early 1990s, the statewide Pride Festival had never been held outside of the Triangle. And when a group of young, radical, I would say radical, activists got together and they said, you know what, we're gonna have a Pride March here in Charlotte. And they went to do a pitch for the statewide Pride. People laughed at them. And they laughed not because they didn't think Charlotte could pull it off, but because they said Charlotte's not political. Durham is political. Raleigh is political, but Charlotte is not political. And boy, were they wrong about it. Not only were we political, we were engaging in all kinds of political actions in Charlotte. But to host the first Pride March in Marshall Park is very important because it gives us and the civil rights movement for LGBT people, many of whom are people of color, a connection to an earlier civil rights movement, to protests that were happening in the city around racial equality, especially now with the Charlotte Uprising happening. Connecting us to larger social movements matters. And a march is different than a parade because parades are almost fully celebratory. So we have parades to celebrate. Marches have a political purpose. We are drawing attention to deficits in the community with marches. And it gives us, not that both can be celebratory, they certainly can, but a march allows us to connect ourselves to a larger movement. And so when we're putting on the first Pride March in Charlotte, and we're putting this on in connection with the 93 March on Washington and the 25th anniversary of Stonewall in 1994. So Charlotte is connected to larger social movements at the current moment in the 90s and also past movements. And this space was a perfect place for us to do it. Also, not to put too fine a point on it, marching around in Uptown makes a lot of sense. When you think about the very first Gay Pride Day that we had in Charlotte in 1980, it was held at UNCC because at that time, UNCC was considered so far from Uptown that there was no way you could be outed because no one would drive all the way to hell out to University City to do anything. It was Charlotte far, which in my head is 20 minutes from anything else. And so thinking about taking something from a fringe part of the town and putting it in Uptown is very important. And our subsequent Pride festivals that were had at Gateway Village and in now the huge one that we have in Uptown show the growth of what it meant for us to stake a claim politically as well as socially in these spaces. Now, my particular obsession of LGBT history is in spaces, specifically public spaces. Freedom Park, I mean, I'm sure all of you have walked through Freedom Park. Maybe you've ridden a bike through Freedom Park. Maybe you've nearly been hit by a scooter in Freedom Park. I have all those things have happened to me. But public parks, especially Freedom Park in Charlotte, were very cruisy in the early years when people were just trying to connect sexually with each other to have some kind of community connectivity. But because the cat was out of the bag in Freedom Park in regards to what we were doing, parks also became sites of a lot of police raids. One of the largest police raids at the time in the US happened in the late 1970s at Freedom Park. Over the course of several days, nearly 30 men are arrested and then booked at the time for what was considered, I know this is a very hyperbolic statement to make, but there were still only 2 punishments for what was considered sodomy in North Carolina up until Lawrence v. Texas in 2003. That was life in prison and the death penalty. Now, they hadn't put anybody to death in North Carolina for sodomy for a very long time, but that's on the books. And so they're arresting these men and then engaging in the most humiliating behavior they could find, which was they would publish their names, they would publish their jobs in the newspaper. The Observer put front page articles of the names of all the people that were arrested. There was a man who was arrested in the park who was a professor at UNC Charlotte. His name was Norfleet Gerald. He did not go quietly. He didn't. He contested his arrest, saying that you couldn't possibly arrest 2 people for engaging in activity that was outside the public venue, right? They weren't on a swing set if they were off in the woods. They did it on purpose so people wouldn't see them. He fought his conviction, and up until the day he died, he eventually was pardoned by the governor of the governor of North Carolina in the late 1980s, shortly before his death. And because of his fight to clear his name, he lost his job at UNCC. He lost his credibility in the community, but he fought up until the day that he died to make certain that people knew that he had done nothing wrong. And that is a powerful statement to make. And quite frankly, these police raids lasted up until 2002. The last large-scale police raid of gay men in a park was in Alabama in 2002, in a place called River Road Park in Tuscaloosa, where 25 men were arrested over the course of 7 days. This was months really before Lawrence v. Texas happened, and suddenly we're all legal people again, which is ridiculous and yet still true. So when you go to Freedom Park, I actually took a group of my students to Freedom Park to talk to them about cruising one time, which they loved, but I did get a reprimand. So, I mean, it happens. I would absolutely do it again. I would totally take my students cruising in the park again, 100%. It's totally worth it. And people are still cruising in that park too, by the way. I won't tell you how I know that. This is the original home of Tonda Taylor on Beverly Drive in the Myers Park neighborhood. What's important about this space is that when Tonda left Charlotte, she left Charlotte so she could become a full person. She was at night too, the Stonewall riots. In her oral history, she talks about the fact that she stepped off the curb and into a protest and became part of a movement. When she returns home to Charlotte in the late 1980s to take care of her brother who was HIV positive, she lived in this house with her partner. And one of the things they realized was there was almost no outreach for young people. And so this house, the living room of this house, is where they had the original Time Out Youth meetings, which at the time could have gotten her in so much trouble. She could have been arrested for the work that she was doing. And so when you think about the work that Time Out Youth is doing now, I want you to remember that it started in this very small house in Myers Park. And it was the work of people who saw a need in the community. By the way, they went big with Time Out Youth, which I've always appreciated. You know, she starts having students meet in her house around 91, 92. By the end of the 90s, there's a billboard advertising Time Out Youth in Uptown Charlotte, which is kind of baller that they went that quickly to put this out into the world. And there are pictures of that too in the archive. oh, this picture makes me so sad because they have torn down this building since the last time we were there. I tried to find a picture of the building, but Donaldson King lived in the upper left, if you're staring at the building, upper left apartment. And in his front living room, he started what he and his friends affectionately called the Friends of Dorothy bookstore, which was basically just some shelves with some books on it. But it was this idea that he had about providing people with access to knowledge. And so the Friends of Dorothy bookstore, it is technically a bookstore, not in the sense that we imagine it now, but having this space where people could come and then purchase books is super important because, again, we're arming ourselves with our own understanding. If you can imagine, okay, so this is, it was on Euclid, but if you imagine being on East Boulevard, right, at the intersection of South and East, and many of you know where Paper Skyscraper is, right? So this is across the street from Paper Skyscraper. Where Paper Skyscraper is now is where Rising Moon and Beyond Books was. And so Sue Henry and her partner opened that in the 90s. They eventually have 3 locations in North Carolina for Rising Moon and Beyond. But the Friends of Dorothy bookstore, which is right across the street, that little tiny space makes me so happy, although I'm so sad that the building's gone, but knowing the work that we were doing to really give people access to their own identity in a very small way. Now, many of you, I imagine, remember going to Olean's Lounge. And although I never set foot in this bar because it was gone by the time I moved to Charlotte, sadly, what I want you to remember about Olean's Lounge is that this bar was started as almost like a social experiment to see, if we could in fact have a space that would allow people to come in and be fully celebratory. Olean's was a drag bar. And in the 70s, Olean's Lounge was actually home to one of the largest variety shows related to trans women. There were a lot of trans women who were in the process of transitioning in Charlotte in the 70s who got their first jobs at Olean's performing, and not necessarily doing like lip syncing drag, which is what we think of now as a drag performance. But there was at one point a show that Boom Boom Latour was the MC for, where they had people juggling knives, they had people spitting fire, and so lots of different kinds of things. But Olean's offered a lot of trans women a space to be themselves, even if it was just for a few hours a week. And so while people want to dismiss gay bars as being important to the community, for a lot of people, Olean Love created a space that allowed people to truly and wonderfully be themselves. And honestly, I'm a postmodernist. Things can be two things. It can be liberatory and divey at the same time. That's fine. I'm okay with that. Everything has to be pristine constantly. So this is the building for Club South Charlotte. Again, bathhouses played such an important role in the community, and not just for hooking up, although that would be fine if that's all that it did. But bathhouses became a spot of community resistance. They became a place for people to meet. Businesses were formed in these spaces. Relationships were formed in these spaces. I read about Club South in the Charlotte Free Press from the 70s, and there were these full-page ads inviting people to come in. And Club South was interesting. They literally tried everything they could think of to bring people in. At one point in 1976, they had one night a week that was dedicated just for women. Hold for surprise, didn't work out the way they had hoped. Turns out lesbian women don't want to have sex the same way gay men do in public spaces. So note to self, just in case you're going to open up a bathhouse. But the thing to keep in mind about Club South was that, I now think of South End as kind of like super bougie and super gentrified. But at the time, South End was straight up gross. It was the edge of town. You could open up a business for about $11 and a handshake because nobody wanted to be there because it was so sketch. But that's great for us. I mean, Charlotte had a ton of gay bars in it, in these locations in South End in the 70s and 80s because we could get a business license and we were bringing business to the neighborhood. But Club South was huge. I'm gonna tell you the story because it's my favorite story. When Club South closed in 1985 and they sold all the contents of the building except what was in the basement, they had not There was no way for them to put an in-ground pool in this building because the building had been built. So they put an above the ground pool in Club South. In the back would have been the loading dock. That you can imagine all the shenanigans happening in that pool over the course of a decade in a bathhouse. But they literally closed Club South like on a Thursday, and that Friday they sold that swimming pool to an assisted living facility for water aerobics. So literally people were having sex in that pool on a Tuesday, and by Saturday they were doing water aerobics in it, and that just makes me so freaking happy. I love that. I also, by the way, have a key to Club South on my key ring, so I always tell everybody, if I invent a time machine, you'll know where I'll be. Room 207 at Club South Charlotte, because I have the key. Club Mix is also a really important part of our history that is widely overlooked. Club Mix is one of the very first African-American owned and operated gay bars in Charlotte. Club Mix became a site of not just like celebration and drag, but it also became a place for people to imagine what a community centered around queer people of color might look like. And so while Club Mix wasn't around as long as a lot of gay bars were in North Carolina, it acted as this space for African-American queer people, and by extension, a lot of other groups of people of color who were queer, to come in and to imagine a space that was theirs, that was centered around their identity. Because you all won't find this hard to believe, but in a lot of places, especially in a lot of gay bars in the 80s and 90s, queer people of color were not just not welcome, but like openly being discriminated against. And so having their own spaces is very important. And so Club Mix is a part of this tradition of what it meant to have these spaces where people could go and be safe and celebrate and have their own community. So as I mentioned before, I run the Invisible Histories Project. We are currently not actively collecting in North Carolina. We're collecting in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. We're moving into the Florida Panhandle in January of next year. I carry the tattoo with me everywhere I go of my work in Charlotte. So we are always happy to help. If anybody has materials, UNCC is always actively collecting in their special collections. They have an amazing staff. But if you have questions, you want to get involved, you have materials that you'd like us to help you find a home for, you can email us at contact@invisiblehistory.org. And because I'm supposed to say this at the end of all my presentations, please follow us on Facebook and Instagram, where all the really interesting stuff is. A lot of really cool things are happening now. And I literally finished right on time for my timer. So I hope that you all got some enjoyment out of that, and that you learned a lot of things. And I'm happy to share the presentation and anything with anybody. And I see now that the chat is blowing up. So who do I throw this off to? Megan?
I was going to, first of all, thank you for that fabulous presentation. And then, yeah, I think we have about 15 or 20 minutes, so we have a good amount of time for questions, which is great. I think the easiest way to do this would probably be for folks, you're welcome to use the chat, or you're welcome to use the raise your hand feature, which you'll find kind of at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so we can take a good number of questions, I think. The first one I grabbed from the chat while you were speaking, this was from Erin Alsop. She says, I'm the archivist for Central Piedmont Community College who recently discovered a fault line in our archive due to a lack of records on our institutional LGBTQ history. A group of us will meet next week to begin conversations on how best to build an archival collection honoring that history, and wondering if you or anyone else on the call have any words of advice or wisdom.
Oh man, that is such a good question. So I'm going to cop out just a tiny little bit and say this. Part of IHP's mission is to help support and to encourage these kinds of new collections. So if the folks at CPCC want to schedule a chat with the staff or IHP, we are happy to share everything with you. Our foundational documents, our workflow. We have, if you go to our website, invisiblehistory.org, we have a resources tab there. Honestly, I would, having been on your campus, I know that it won't be as difficult as you think building this institutional repository, because there are a lot of people that feel very connected. So email me, I'll put my email address in the chat, and let's set up a time to chat. We would love to support you in any way that we can. I also can't type when people are looking at me, so don't look at me while I type this. Okay, I'm done now. Yes, get at it, y'all, at CPCC. That's awesome. And you've got a great resource at UNCC around the corner. I know that they would be happy to help you. Dawn has been dropping amazing things into the chat. So, but yeah, that's a great project for you. I'm so glad.
I will capture all the links that Dawn has been sharing and some from anyone else, and include those in the follow-up email as well. So that way, if you're missing notes, we can do that. It looks like Crystal has her hand up. What's your question, Crystal?
Hey, Josh, great presentation. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. So thank you for that today. Just wanted to mention, and I had to step away a couple of times with work, so I may have missed this, so forgive me if you covered it. But I work for a healthcare system here in Charlotte, and we do a lot of work with transgender care and LGBTQ care. And I know historically in med schools, this hadn't really been a topic with how to treat or even approach or have patient to provider conversations with members of the LGBTQ community. And so I just wanted to say that I think that healthcare is transitioning in a way, and my hope is that within the next couple of years we'll be much more further along than we are now, and then that can be part of the tour as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, healthcare is such a good place to have this conversation, because literally for healthcare to include trans people at any level, it has to be taken apart and then rebuilt, even within existing systems, right? Like the idea of having a dead name in the system, like is what they call it, the trans broken arm syndrome, where like a trans person falls and breaks their arm, they go to the emergency room, and suddenly the problem is that they're trans, right? And not the arm, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I hope that we're able to add all of that into future conversations, for sure.
And even things like lab results, like there's not standards for lab results for individuals who are transitioning currently, things like that we just need more time to gather the data. So my hope is like in the next 3 years, that's part of this, this journey.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Crystal. Does anyone else have a question they want to ask Josh?
I actually have a question.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Relating back to our fault lines theme, Josh, I know from having conversations with you when we did the in-person tours year before last, and then even putting this together today, you've talked about some of the fault lines that exist, not just between Charlotte's LGBTQ community and the straight community, but within the community itself. And I wonder, what is the primary root of those fault lines from your perspective? Is it primarily generational or economic or racial, or a combination?
This is a very dangerous question to ask a political radical, so brace yourself for my answer. But I think that we have overblown the generational differences between older queer people and younger queer people. If you look at decision-making processes for queer people over 65 who are thinking about retirement, they're thinking about potentially, assisted living facilities and long-term care, they're making decisions about what happens to their life, knowing that they are going to be facing discrimination in healthcare and in assisted living facilities, and potentially not having access to like family who would theoretically take care of you. That is a very similar experience to a queer kid who's 14 years old. And so there's so much commonality on opposite ends of that spectrum. When you go in and you put those two groups together, they have so much that they both can learn and want to learn from each other, that I think that generational difference is a bit overblown. Truthfully, I think we have an economic problem in the queer community. We don't know how to talk about class anywhere. And because of that, we want to paint every gay person as wealthy and white and living in, a glass tower in Uptown, when in reality, most of us are people of color, working class, poor, undereducated because we don't have access to student loans, and no generational wealth. And so you see racism in the queer community by people who should know better. I mean, things don't have to be the same to be similar. Like if you have been discriminated against, it shouldn't be a large leap for you to see other people being discriminated against. And yet money makes things very difficult. It's the reason why I get so annoyed. Here we go. Sorry, y'all. Y'all gotta line me up into this point. But it's the reason why I get so annoyed by the things that we choose to like rah-rah and celebrate. Like, we wanted to make the fight for same-sex marriage about Edie Windsor. And, you know, and she had legitimate complaints, but the real talk of it all is she had an individual personal net worth of nearly $15 million. Like, I don't know about you, but I see people wearing I Am Edie Windsor t-shirts and I want to ask them for a loan because I don't have $15 million. That is not my issue. My issue was being let go from a job that I had because I was gay. Like, that was my issue. Like, trying to stay employed was my issue. And so there are so many ways that we could be doing better, raising our own bar in the queer community and looking at how we as white cis people are reenacting transphobia and racism and sexism, but we just, I don't know if it's not too complicated. It's just that we want to like celebrate the lowest possible bars and it causes problems within the community. Also, it's not a monolith. I mean, no two groups of people have less in common in the world than gay men and lesbians. We don't move through the world the same. We got lumped together because we supported each other, because we loved each other, not because we were the same. And so it's the reason why we need to take a very hard look at who we are as a community if what we really want to do is grow and move and change and evolve, which I think is what we want. But it is going to take a lot more than just waving a flag once a year at a parade for us to do that. I mean, it really is. And so we're going to have to start talking about class. We just will. Otherwise, we are just screwed. And I'm working in a state, Mississippi has so much poverty. And yet their queer communities are robust. They're robust because they are all being ground up very slowly in a capitalist economic machine. And because of that, they fight tooth and nail for each other. I mean, we interviewed a trans kid who said he felt safer in Hazel Green, Mississippi than he did in New York. Because at least in Hazel Green, Mississippi, he had a community. Like, that's very telling. And I think we could do better. I have faith in the queer community, even though they annoy me a lot. But I can say that because I'm professionally gay. So it's fine if they annoy me. Because I've seen us do better. I do. I mean, I'm climbing through your attics and looking through your old personal letters. I know we've done better. And because of that, I have to hold a higher standard to our behavior than most people will. And if that makes me difficult, that's fine. I'm okay being difficult. But, you know, we can do better.
Josh, we will take you and your difficulty all day long and twice on Sunday. Thanks
so much.
It's
hard to see it from this high horse I'm on. Let me step down off this box. Hold on. Y'all ask good questions. Who has questions? I love to answer questions. So like, you can throw something at me.
So Josh, I remember in an earlier edition, you told a story about a women's bar in the bottom of the hotel.
Oh, the Behringer.
Really
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So
tell that story.
Please, yes. Technically the first gay bar in Charlotte is in the bottom floor of the Behringer Hotel. It was a guerrilla style gay bar in the 1940s. If you're not familiar with guerrilla gay bars, guerrilla like G-U, not G-O. I said guerrilla gay bar one time and someone said, I don't know, what do monkeys have to do with gay bars? I mean, you ever been to a gay bar? It's fairly similar. But yeah, so there was a young woman who had lied about her age. She became a secretary in the Behringer in the 40s, and she was a lesbian. And she had a very tight-knit community of people that she knew, but they weren't expanding out because there weren't any gay bars at the time. But she was responsible for taking the money from upstairs and then taking it downstairs to the basement to be locked in the safe. And she kind of realized that on Tuesday nights, that bar, which was mostly full of businessmen, you know, the Behringer has a lot in common with Stonewall in the sense that it was like a pet project run by someone's underperforming nephew. And so like they had given him this hotel to like have something to do. So Tuesday nights, there was almost nobody in the bar. And so the subsequent Tuesday night, she invited a bunch of her friends to come because the bar was empty and they could just all be lesbians in the bar together. And then the word got out in the community that there was this place that you could go. And so several weeks after that, that bar was packed full of closeted gay people on Tuesday nights. And it became the go-to spot. The Hornet's Nest is what it was called. It became the go-to spot for queer people in Uptown Charlotte in the 40s. And so that guerrilla style gay bar, it really does connect us to a lot of other places. I mean, if you really think about it, the oldest still continually operated gay bar in this whole country is Lafitte in Exile in New Orleans. It opened in 1945. It is still open today. In fact, I was there right before COVID. But imagine that they're opening gay bars in New Orleans, where, you know, weird is in all caps, right? And so you're probably good there. At the same time that we're operating this guerrilla style gay bar in Charlotte. I love that. I love that idea that we were kind of like sneaking in. And it's because of things like that we were allowed to have O'Leans and, you know, the Blue Note and Scorpio and Chasers and 316 and all these places that we have, because it's stuff like that. I think that's really cool.
Hi, Josh. I have a question for you.
Sure.
So in the very beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that kind of the attention is coming onto the South and maybe Charlotte in particular, and you made a comment offhand that it's not great. And I was hoping that you could expound upon that and the reason why.
Y'all trying to get me in trouble on this presentation. Here's the real truth of it all. Like, you know, the South has always suffered from interventions, you know, in the modern era. We've always suffered from interventions from outside because people don't imagine that we are organized, right? And so people show up and they think they've got like the best idea for us, but they haven't asked anybody locally if that was a good idea or not. And so they show up with ideas, they bully their way in, and suddenly we have a problem. And so all of a sudden now there's this group and people are like, well, no, who are these people? Like, where do they even come from? And that's what's happening right now. I couldn't tell you why in particular the Queer South is really hot right now. It's just that if my inbox is any metric, we get requests for news reports and for podcasts and stuff from people all over the country that like, ooh, let's talk about the South. And I'm like, I mean, okay, like which part? Like our food, our music, our culture, our architecture, you know, our gay bars. Like, what do you want to talk about? Because in the 90s, we used to call it the zoo problem. And a lot of you probably remember doing this, like when you would get asked to sit on a panel, right? And it was like, here's a gay and here's a lesbian and here's a bisexual or whatever. And like, we would have to sit and like talk about all gay people as if we were the same. I feel like that's what's happening in the South. It's like, oh, well, you're gay and in Alabama, and they give me that little sad face as if somehow like I got sentenced here because I did something wrong in a better place. And I mean, I think I told the last group before. I mean, I've been in all but like 7 states giving talks over the last 15 years. And anytime I say, well, I'm queer and I'm from Alabama, people go, Like give me that little head tilt. Like I had just escaped earlier that morning. And I'm like, you understand that like I live 5 blocks from a gay bar and there's like a church in my neighborhood and 50 gay businesses and like things are tough, but like we're fine. You know what I mean? Like we're fine. You know who has problems? San Francisco. Because people can't live there because it's too expensive, right? That's a problem. Or that the Castro refused to open up an LGBT homeless youth shelter because it was going to lower their property values, but you don't want to live in Birmingham? Okay, that's cool. Yeah. More chicken for me. Stay in the Castro. You're fine. Our food is better. So I hate the idea of this intervention from outside groups without our consent. That's what I mean. It bothers me. I famously was recorded. And again, I've taken flack from this too, but when the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus came through several years ago on their little tour of the South or whatever, and I got into an argument with their director at the library where I was being filmed because I got tired of hearing them say how they had showed up here to help us. And after he said it the 3rd time, I said, you know, we have a Gay Men's Chorus in town, right? You know, we have one voice chorus that is mostly gay, right? Like, you know, that's already happening. And he said, well, we're just here to do whatever. And there's a documentary called Gay Chorus Deep South. You can watch me saying this to this man because I made it to the documentary of me going, who the hell asked you to come here? Like, who called you and said 911, send a chorus full of gays to Charlotte? Like, how about you all take that shit and go home? Because we're good. So like, we're fine. Thanks for stopping by, Steve from San Francisco. That's the stuff that annoys me. It's not that they come and sing, raise some money, do whatever the hell you want to, but don't show up, you know, like you're gonna fix things. You wanna fix stuff? Great, we have things to be fixed. We need to raise money to put people that are homeless in shelters. We need money for that. gay kids need to go to school and not get beat up. We got real issues. But don't come down here like you got the, the pill that's going to fix everything. Damn, that annoys me. I'm still fired up about that. It was 2017, so I'm still fired up about it. Sorry, y'all. I got yelled at one time because of my stance on that, but whatever. It's fine. Yeah, exactly. We have the One Voice Chorus damn records. Like, go and look at them. They're cool. Sorry. I'm not really sorry, to be honest.
Solve the mystery. You just solved the mystery for me. When we were starting to prepare for this with CBI, I could not figure out, I knew I had not met you before, where I had seen your face, and it was that documentary.
Yeah, me yelling at that guy in the documentary.
So thank you for solving that mystery for me.
I literally got a call from a friend of mine who saw the documentary at some film festival, and she's on the phone. She's like, oh my God, I just saw you yelling at some gay dude on a documentary. I was like, oh, good. Meanwhile, I've never watched that documentary, and can I tell you why? When this is all over, go to YouTube and type in Gay Chorus Deep South trailer and see if you can get through the first 2 minutes of that trailer when it opens and says 200 brave souls venture south. Brave souls? What the hell does that mean? We have Michelin star restaurants, for Christ's sake. It's not 1930. Brave souls, get out. Let me show you the door. It's here. Oh, anyway, I never got through the trailer, so I never saw myself yelling at that dude. But enjoy. If you want to watch it, enjoy.
So I did want to ask something just for me. I know we often frame kind of LGBTQ history in terms of progress we've made as a community, and certainly that there's a lot of truth in that. But I'm curious, as a historian, if there's anything that you see that we might have lost that you wish we'd held on to.
Oh my God. I mean, that is such a dangerous question for me, because there's, every archivist in the world that I know that work with, we have these lists of like wish items that we wish we could put our hands on for collections, not because they have like monetary value, but because we know that they have like community and research value. Things that are like pivotal pieces that will allow us to see like a deeper understanding. I just recently took an item off my white whale list here in Alabama, a copy of the first published gay publication in Alabama that came out of Huntsville in 1973. It has a terrible name, which I'm going to tell you, but just brace yourself because it's awful. It's called Gay Seed. I know. Unfortunate name, but a beautiful publication that was done by queer artists from Appalachia as early as 1974. And so it's that kind of stuff that like the pieces that we can fill in, because it is a mosaic. Building archival collections, I think people only they don't think about donating their materials because they're not important enough, but people should understand that we all have a piece of the history. And every individual collection, every organizational collection, every story that we get, that adds to one more piece of that puzzle that allows us to complicate the overall story of who it is that we are as people. And so instead of what we're missing, I would say, we are in the process right now of working with partners in New Orleans, Georgia, the Smithsonian, and Kentucky, Arkansas, to do one of the largest digital projects related to queer publications. And so we're going to be pushing out publications from the 60s all the way up to the present, because that's what I want people to see. Those things still exist. And you can see so much of who you are looking at, the original Q Notes newsletter, when it was Queen City Coordinators. There's so much stuff there. I just wish that more people could see it. That's really what I wish. But it puts us in a quandary, because I think that things need to stay local. I would never want to build a museum and then hoover out all the Charlotte collections to put in some faraway place. I want them to stay in Charlotte so that you can see them. And I want that to be the true where we are now. So yeah, I just wish that we knew more about, I just wish we understood more about how radical and diverse the community has been. And, and such a full stop got put on it during the AIDS epidemic naturally, but we never really recovered that sense of who we were as people that weren't just fighting for marriage in the military. In the 1970s, we were fighting against nuclear power and fighting for the environment and against the Vietnam War and defunding, places that were profiteering from apartheid. There were queer people involved in all of that. And we could be involved in all of that again if we understood that our queer experience allows us to see things from a different perspective. but that's not really what we're doing. And that's what frustrates me. But my job is not to tell you about the history. My job is to provide you with access to the materials that can help you understand history. I understand my marching days are well and truly over. I am in my 40s solidly. I will be 50 sooner than I'm comfortable with, but it's fine. And my job now is to work my ass off to preserve these collections so that you all as a group of people on this call can go into the archives and then put those pieces together. Like we all have a job to do, and this is mine, and I'm okay with that, 100%. Even if, I got pneumonia last year from a collection I was working on. That's not fun, but I'm willing to take pneumonia once a year if it means that you guys can read these kick-ass newsletters that we're pulling out of attics all over the place. By the way, the Mississippi, this month in Mississippi and the Lesbian Front will be available for free on our website. So you'll be able to go and download all the issues that we've digitized. You really should. They will knock your socks off. They're so, so good.
I, for one, definitely will.
Oh, yeah.
And with that, I think it's about time that I should probably pass it back to Annetta, who can tell us a little bit more about kind of the what's next piece of our time together. Annetta, will you take it?
Sure, I will take it. Josh, my friend, oh my God, it is just always such a freaking pleasure. Just because of your knowledge and your energy and your generosity to make sure that everybody has access to something that's literally your life's work, is what I see it as. So I love you and thank you so much.
I love you guys too. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. It's a great way to spend the first part of my day.
Great. First part, yes. So for what's next, all of the information that you have taken in today will be available later today, the recording, along with the links that were in the chat. Megan will provide that to everybody that signed up through Eventbrite. And also, we invite you to go to the CBI website, which is cbicharlotte.org. On our website, there is a ton of resources. Of course, our work is all steeped in equity, and there are a ton of resources. There is information from our partner organizations under our Things to Do tab, and we invite you as well. The weather is so beautiful lately. We have our virtual our curiosity tour, which is also on the site. Christy just popped the link to the Things to Do in the chat, and I just invite you to click on there and just find out more information. And as I said, and I will say again, all of the information that Josh has shared will be available. He has no problem sharing information. And so we will compile that and get it out to everybody. And with that, I will turn it over to Diane English.
Oh, thank you. Josh, it's just a gift to spend time with you always, as Annetta said, and all of us know. You can't miss the passion that you have or the experience that you have and your capacity to help us see things that are deep inside of you and deep inside of us that we have not yet explored. And so the points that landed on me, I think for all of us, we heard something that will help us. And I know you're probably looking at if that tree behind you in the yard next door is coming your way. I
know, I keep looking to make sure it's not falling on my house.
So we don't want to see that. So all we say is thank you. And thanks to this wonderful CBI team of Annetta and Christy and Megan who pulled this program together. We've got two things. I want to ask one thing and then I want to invite you to one thing. If you have appreciated what you've experienced today, we'd love for you to help us do more of these kinds of programs. So if you are not already part of the CBI family as a donor, it's real easy to become one. You go to that website that Annetta was talking about, and there's a donate button you just can't miss. If we've done our job, you just can't miss it. Use it and join us. And we will be so sincerely grateful. And just as we are for the experience we've had today. So here's the deal. You know that all the great conversations happen in parking lots, or the most important things you want to remember are on the back of a deposit slip or something you can, grab in your pocket or your purse. And so we're gonna arrange this little parking lot that you can occupy for the next 10 to 15 minutes with Josh and us, and we're just gonna chat. So if you've got the time and want to hang around for just this little parking lot conversation, we're going to be here. And if you can't, just know how grateful we are that you've made our day by showing up, because you can have this cool program, you can have wonderful information, you can have all of this, but you're the ones that make it worthwhile by showing up. And so to each of you, we send our sincere thanks, and we just want to stay connected, however that works for you. So thanks. So we'll see you in the parking lot, and have a great afternoon and stay close. Thank you. Josh, don't go anywhere.
I'm not. I'm right here. Unless a tree comes through this window.